We're reading from Matthew chapter 26, beginning at verse 6. And when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him, having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. When his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor." But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time he sought an opportunity to betray him. Then if you go on over into chapter 27, let's just read a little bit of a follow-up there from that. Chapter 27, beginning at verse 3. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." And they said, "What is that to us? You see to it." Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed, and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, "It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they are the price of blood." They consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me." As I've told you before, I find it kind of interesting when I'm watching an old movie or an old TV show to notice the difference in the prices of certain things compared to what they are today. For example, on the old Andy Griffith show, sometimes there might be a scene taking place there on Main Street right in front of their little grocery store. And you can see that there are placards up on the window advertising their sale items and how much various items cost. Now, some of it's hard to compare because they packaged some of it differently back then. The price might be based on how many pounds you get instead of cans or bags like they may be packaged today. But some things you can tell. And those prices just seem ridiculously low compared to what we pay for our groceries today. Or other times, they go into Floyd's barbershop and you see on the board on the wall that you can get a haircut for just $2. Or they talk about eating at the local diner and getting a full meal, I mean a full meal, for $1.25. We can't even get a drink for that. And then there are other times when they refer to the prices of cars and houses. You know, we pay far more for cars today than they paid for houses back then. But then, on the other side, you hear about the salaries they were paid at the time compared to today, and you realize that their income was a lot less too. But it shows how the value of different things varies over time. Some growing more valuable, and others depreciating in value. Now, we've seen in recent years how the housing market can go up and down. I won't forget how I guess it was about 15 years ago when the economy took a big downward turn and the housing market turned sour. Cheryl and I were able to take a vacation at this fancy resort in Florida, a place we normally wouldn't have been able to afford, but they were in the process of building it when the economy went bad, so some of it was incomplete and empty. And as a result, it wasn't any more expensive for us to stay there than it would have been normally to stay in some little motel room in many other places along the beach. And we pretty much had the whole place to ourselves. The value of other things people collect vary. You know, old coins, baseball cards, artwork. As someone has said, they're worth as much as someone is willing to pay for them at the time. Well, this morning, I believe the Lord wants us to think about how much we value Him. How much we value Jesus. How much is Jesus worth to us? What price tag would we put on Him and on our relationship with Him? Now, it's easy for us to say that He's priceless or that He's worth everything to us. And that would be a good answer. But is that true? Is that the value we reflect by the way we live our lives each day? Do we really live like Jesus is everything to us? Or do our lives show that He actually seems to mean very little to us? Or maybe there was a time when Jesus meant everything to us, but has that changed? Do we still value Him to that same degree? Let's consider those questions as we look at a couple of examples from this passage of Scripture that we read from the Gospel of Matthew. One of the examples we read about here is Judas, one of the 12 apostles, numbered among Jesus' closest followers. Yet in spite of all the miracles Judas had witnessed Jesus do, in spite of all the truthful and inspiring teaching he had heard from the very lips of the Son of God, Judas ended up betraying Jesus, providing the opportunity for Jesus' enemies to arrest Him. Judas went to the chief priest and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they gave him 30 pieces of silver for his act of betrayal. 30 pieces of silver. Now that wasn't just some random amount. If you go back to the book of Exodus, back to when God was giving Moses the 10 Commandments and the other laws up on Mount Sinai, you find a section there about punishments and restitutions for certain actions, especially regarding personal injuries and property loss. For example, if a man dug a pit and left it uncovered, and somebody's ox or donkey fell in that pit and died, then the owner of the pit would have to pay for the animal. Or if a man's ox gored or killed someone, the ox would be killed. But if the ox had shown itself in the past to be a danger or a threat, if it had injured others in the past and the owner hadn't taken proper precautions to keep it confined and it ended up killing someone, then the owner himself could be held responsible and put to death. I guess a law like that today might help reduce some of the problems some of us encounter or hear about concerning people letting their vicious dogs wander around and they end up attacking people or other people's pets. But going back to those ancient laws, if that violent ox killed someone's servant, although the ox would still be put to death, its owner wouldn't lose his life in that case. He would simply have to pay the master of that servant a sum of money for the damages, a sum totaling 30 pieces of silver. Now that was certainly a lighter punishment than being executed. And back in Moses' day, that wasn't an insignificant amount of money. Even the life of a servant was worth something. But over the years, 30 pieces of silver probably came to have less and less value. It wasn't insignificant, but it certainly wasn't the price you'd put on a person's life. It was the minimal value of a servant or slave. We see in our day how prices and values can change in 50, 60, 70 years since those old TV shows were made that we were talking about. So you can imagine that after over 1,000 years went by, probably closer to 14 or 1,500 years from Moses' day to Jesus' day, that 30 pieces of silver probably didn't seem like as much. In a sense, it was a token, the minimal value put on the lowest of slaves. And yet that's the amount the chief priest offered Judas to betray Jesus to them. And Judas took it. He didn't argue that Jesus was worth more. He was willing to take whatever he could get. We read where Judas tried to return the money later and undo his deed. But the chief priests would have no part of it. So Judas threw down the money and went out and killed himself. And they ended up using the money to buy a field to bury strangers in. So it was enough to purchase a small plot of land. Matthew notes that this was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. There's a little textual matter you might want to take note of there in chapter 27, verses 9 and 10. It says that these words were spoken by Jeremiah the prophet. However, the quote actually most resembles something from the book of Zechariah. Jeremiah did buy a plot of land, so it may have been related to that, but there's actually a couple of likely explanations for that. A few manuscripts only say the prophet. They don't name anyone. So maybe that was the original statement in the original manuscript, and somewhere along the way as the manuscript was copied, some scribe added the name Jeremiah to it. Or others have noted that Jeremiah was the first book in the section of Hebrew scriptures known as the writings of the prophets. And there were occasions when that whole section of writings were just referred to as the writings of Jeremiah. So that may be why it's referred to in that way here. So, like I said, that's just a side note, but it's something that you might have noticed and wondered about if you tried to look up that quote in the Old Testament. But notice what it says, that quote. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced. In other words, this was the value they put on Jesus. That was the value the chief priest put on him. The value Judas accepted and put on the Son of God. The old-time minimal price for a slave. That's all that Jesus was worth to them. Now that stands in contrast to the other example that we read about. The incident that took place just before Judas went to the chief priest to betray Jesus. It's the occasion when the woman anoints Jesus with oil or perfume. And notice that it's described here as very costly, fragrant oil. And it's been a while since I've done it, but the last time I walked by and looked in the glass doors of the cabinet at the grocery store at a department store that contains perfumes and colognes, I got sticker shock. I can't imagine paying that much to smell good. Now, I'll stick with my cheaper cologne, although it's getting harder to find and it's gone up in price too. But this woman didn't use a cheap bottle of perfume. It was obvious that this was the good stuff. This was the expensive, fragrant oil. And she freely, generously poured it on Jesus. When the disciples saw what she was doing, some of them got upset. They were critical of the woman's actions. They called it a waste. They suggested that a better use of the oil would have been to have sold it and to use the money to help the poor and the needy. And although we're told elsewhere that Judas was the main person suggesting this, and his motives were far from pure. He was the treasurer for the group, and he had been stealing from their funds. So he wasn't really concerned about the poor. He just wanted to get his hands on that money. But Jesus called the act of this woman a good work. A good work. He said that it was appropriate because she had done it for his burial. Now, I don't know that she realized that. I don't know that she looked at it with that purpose in mind. She seems to have been doing it simply as an act of worship, showing her devotion and her love for Jesus. And in doing that, she was showing how much value she put on Jesus. She was willing to part with this very costly oil. She was willing to use it all up on Jesus. Maybe she had some cheaper oil that she could have brought and used, but she brought the expensive stuff. Why? Because Jesus was worth it to her. He really was everything to her, and she showed it by her actions. Think of the contrast in those two examples. Judas valued Jesus so little that he was willing to betray him for the minimal price of a slave. And this woman valued Jesus so much that she was willing to bring what probably was her most expensive possession and extravagantly pour it out on Jesus as an act of love and devotion to him. Judas didn't think Jesus was worth very much. This woman thought Jesus was worth everything, all that she had. And that takes us back to our original questions. How much is Jesus worth to us? What value do we put on him? Unfortunately, maybe some of us resemble Judas more than we would like to admit. That we might hang around with Jesus on Sunday at church or at other times, but our hearts are far from being completely devoted to him. Maybe we like what we can gain from Jesus and from being around him, the benefits of being known as one of his followers. But if some particular temptation comes along, or if the world offers us something that looks better or more appealing to us, we tend to quickly turn away from Jesus and from what we know he wants us to do, and we sell him out for some momentary pleasure or for some other selfish gain. Maybe some of us would have to admit that in our daily lives, it's really not too hard for us to forget about Jesus, to turn our backs on him and his will for us, and to betray him for a measly 30 pieces of silver, or for some worldly pleasure, or for our 15 minutes of fame, or whatever else we might gain from doing so. But maybe others of us do resemble more the woman who anointed Jesus with oil, that we have a real and deep affection for Jesus and really want to follow him. He does mean everything to us, and we're willing to put him ahead of everything else in our lives. But some of us still need to be careful that we don't fall short of her example. Maybe we aren't completely yielded to the Lord, so we bring our cheaper perfume to offer to him instead of what we really value most in our lives. Maybe we want to express our love for him, but at the same time we hold back from completely giving ourselves and all that we have to him. We value and love the Lord, but we still value a few other things more than him, and we're unwilling to sacrifice them for his sake. We love Jesus, but not enough to completely yield to his will and his control over our lives. Maybe we would be willing to pour a few drops of that costly oil on Jesus, but not the whole alabaster flask. How much should we value Jesus? We used to sing a chorus that declared, "Jesus is my all in all." And it says in one part of it says, "He is the treasure that I seek." That goes along with what the Bible says. That the Bible describes the kingdom of heaven as being like a treasure hidden in a field. And it says that a man goes and sells all that he has and buys that field where the treasure is located. Jesus should be our treasure. And we should be willing to sacrifice whatever necessary to sell all that we have in order to have him. In other words, we should be willing to do whatever it takes in order to possess that treasure. Those other things in our lives we tend to treasure and put so much value on need to take a back seat to Jesus. We may not have to get rid of them altogether. They may still be able to be part of our lives. But Jesus should mean more to us than anything else. Those other things may need to take a subordinate place in our lives, subordinate to him. The Bible also compares the kingdom of heaven to a pearl of great price. And again, it says that a man went and sold all that he had in order to buy that pearl. Now, Jesus should be our treasure. He should be our pearl of great price. And he should mean more to us than anything or anything else. And that priority and our devotion to him should reflect itself in our lives. Jesus suggested that his followers need to love him more than parents, wives, husbands, and children. He told his followers that they can't be his disciples unless they forsake all that they have. In other words, he has to come first, and they have to value him more than their worldly possessions. Now, the Lord may not call us to literally sell everything and follow Him, but we need to value those things less than we value Him. Jesus truly should be everything to us. How much do we value Him? How completely are we devoted to Him? Now, maybe when we first got saved, He really was everything to us. But unfortunately, that can change over time. We can allow the years the years that pass to depreciate the value that we put on Jesus. At one time, maybe He was our treasure and the love of our life. But is He still today? Or have other things come along and taken priority over Him? We each have to look at our own hearts to judge that. But we also ought to be willing to look at our lives and what our actions actually reveal about what is really important to us and what place Jesus actually has in our lives. Are we living like Jesus is our treasure, our pearl of great price, our everything? Maybe we need to renew our love and our devotion for Him today. I remind you of the words of a song. It says, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather be His than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by His nail-pierced hand. I'd rather have Jesus than men's applause. I'd rather be faithful to His dear cause. I'd rather have Jesus than worldwide fame. I'd rather be true to His holy name. He's fairer than lilies of rarest bloom. He's sweeter than honey from out of the comb. He's all that my hungering spirit needs. I'd rather have Jesus and let Him lead than to be the king of a vast domain and be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. Think about those words and ask yourself if you truly mean that. Would you rather have Jesus than silver or gold, whether 30 pieces or 30,000 pieces? Would I truly rather have Him than anything this world offers today? How much do we value Jesus?